My name is Sabrina Townsend, and I'm 34 years old. Last Tuesday, I stood outside a lawyer's office in Harlem, Washington, holding a manila folder thin enough to slide under a door and heavy enough to end a woman's entire performance. Inside that room, my stepmom was telling the attorney that the will reading was only for heirs named in the will. I could hear her through the oak door. I could hear my stepbrother Derek laughing. What Vivian didn't know was that my father had made one last phone call from his hospital bed. Not to her, not to her children, but to a woman whose name Vivian had never heard. And that phone call was the reason I was holding a file that would unravel 16 years of lies. Before I take you back to where it all began, please take a moment to like and subscribe. And if you're watching right now, drop your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Now let me take you back to Harlan, Washington, to the autumn I was 14 and the night my mother's hospital room went quiet. The house on Miller Hill had a way of holding sound. My mother's piano notes would linger in the hallway long after she'd stopped playing, like the house itself didn't want the music to end. I grew up in that house. White clapper, green shutters, wraparound porch with a swing my father built the summer I turned 7. Harlan is the kind of town where everybody waves from their car and nobody locks their front door. And my parents were the kind off people who belonged there. My father, Richard Townsend, sold real estate, not the glass tower kind, but the let me show you a place where your kids can ride bikes kind. He started a scholarship fund for local students before I was born. People in Harlem trusted him the way you trust a man who remembers your dog's name and asks about your mother's hip surgery. My mother, Grace, taught piano lessons in the front parlor every Tuesday and Thursday. She grew lavender in the backyard, rose off it, purple and silver green, humming with bees from May through September. The whole house smelled like lavender and lemon polish and whatever she was baking that morning. On Sundays, she made cinnamon rolls and the three of us sat on the porch and ate them while the fog burned off the valley below. She was diagnosed with lung cancer on a Thursday in September. She'd never smoked a cigarette in her life. The doctor said, "Sometimes it just happens that way." And my mother nodded like she understood, which she probably did because Grace Townsend understood most things before anyone explained them. She fought for 11 months. Toward the end, the hospital room smelled like antiseptic and dying flowers, and she held my hand with fingers that had gotten so thin I was afraid to squeeze back. The last thing she said to me 3 days before she died was about the house. "Remember, sweetheart, that house is yours, not the walls or the roof. What your father built inside it." I was 14. I thought she meant the bookshelves. I didn't understand what she really meant until I was 34, standing in a lawyer's office, watching everything my father had built get stolen by a woman who never planted a single seed of lavender in her life. But that came later. First came Vivan. Vivan arrived the way weather changes in the Pacific Northwest. Slowly at first, just a shift in the air. And then all at once, the entire sky was different. 18 months after my mother died, my father started seeing a woman he'd met at a charity auction for the library. Vivian Marsh, tall, blonde, quick smile, the kind of voice that made everything sound like a compliment, even when it wasn't. She worked part-time at a boutique in the next town over and had 2 children from a previous marriage. Derek, who was 12 and already louder than anyone in our house had ever been, and Paige, who was 8 and so quiet I sometimes forgot she was in the room. The town approved. Richard Townsend deserved happiness again, they said. He'd been so lonely since Grace. And Vivian was so charming, so attentive, so eager to fill the gap. They married when I was 16. Vivan moved in with her kids, and the changes started small, the kind you don't argue about because each one seems reasonable on its own. She pulled up my mother's lavender because she said it triggered her allergies. She replaced the lace curtains with linen panels because they let in more light. She converted the piano room into a second living area because nobody plays anymore. I played, she knew that. Derek took my bedroom upstairs. He's older, Sabrina. He needs the space. And I was moved to the small room in the basement. Vivian patted my shoulder the day I carried my boxes downstairs. "I think you'll love having your own little space, sweetheart. Teenagers need privacy, right?" I heard the snip of garden shears through my basement window that afternoon. Vivian cutting the last of my mother's lavender from its roots. Each cut landed like a clock ticking backward, erasing something I couldn't name. My father stood in the kitchen while it happened. He didn't stop her. He looked at me once, then looked away. The way a man looks away when he knows he's choosing wrong, but can't figure out how to choose right. I didn't know it then, but that was the beginning of a pattern. Vivan deciding, my father surrendering, and me disappearing one room at a time. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from sitting at a dinner table with 4 other people and knowing that 3 of them are waiting for you to leave. Vivan ran our household the way some people run a business. Schedules, seating arrangements, approved topics of conversation. Dinner was at 6:30 sharp. Vivian sat at the head of the table, which had been my mother's chair. My father sat to her right, which had been his. I sat at the far end next to the kitchen door, which was nobody's chair because it was next to a draft. Every time I tried to talk to my father alone after dinner on the porch in the car, Vivian appeared. No angry, never angry, just present. "Oh, I was looking for you too." What are we chatting about? And whatever private conversation we might have had dissolved like sugar in hot water. Derek made it worse. He hid my textbooks. He changed the channel when I was watching something. He ate the last of whatever I'd put my name on in the fridge and shrugged when I asked about it. Once he told me at the breakfast table, "This is my house now." And Vivian overheard and laughed. "He's just teasing, Sabrina. You're too sensitive." The floor above my basement room creaked every time Derek walked across it. Some nights I'd lie there and count his footsteps. Each one a small reminder that someone else was living in my space, sleeping in my bed, breathing the air that used to smell like lavender and now smelled like Derek's cheap body spray. My father tried. He'd suggest we drive out to look at properties together, just the 2 of us, the way we used to. But Vivian would pout or sigh or say, "If you keep leaving Derek out, he'll think you don't love him, Richard." And my father, who had never been good at disappointing people, would fold. I overheard Vivian on the phone one evening. She was talking to a friend, her voice low and satisfied, like a woman who just finished rearranging furniture to her liking. "She'll go to college soon, and then everything will settle down. Richard will forget." I was learning something Vivian had already mastered. That you don't need to raise your voice to make someone disappear. You just stop making room for them. I packed 1 suitcase. It wasn't heavy. That was the part that broke me. 18 years of life and everything I needed fit into 26 in of nylon. The decision came the night of my high school graduation. Vivian threw a small party. Potato salad, paper plates, a banner that said, "Congratulations." She invited Derek's friends. She invited Paige's little playdate group. She invited 3 neighbors. She did not invite a single one of my classmates. When I asked why, she tilted her head the way she always did when she wanted to look confused. "Oh, honey, I didn't know who your friends were. You never told me." I had told her twice. I stood in the backyard that night listening to Derek's friends throw a football over the spot where my mother's lavender used to grow, and I understood something clearly for the first time. I had no place here anymore. Not because I'd done something wrong, but because someone had decided I didn't fit, and the one person who should have fought for me was too tired or too guilty or too in love to notice. I wrote the letter the next morning before sunrise. I kept it short because long goodbyes give people a chance to talk you out of things. "I love you, Dad, but I can't stay where I don't belong. I'll be okay." I left it on his pillow, not on the kitchen counter where Vivian would find it first, but on his pillow where he'd see it when he lay down that night. Then I took a Greyhound bus to Seattle at 5 in the morning with diesel fumes and cold fog from the cedar forest wrapping around the bus station like a second sky. I didn't cry on the bus. I cried 3 days later in a studio apartment the size of my old basement room when I realized nobody was coming after me. I wouldn't learn the truth for 16 years that my father had driven to the bus station that morning. He had arrived 20 minutes too late. He'd stood in the empty parking lot with my letter in his hand, reading it over and over until a clerk asked if he needed help. But Vivian told the town a different story. We tried everything. She's just so stubborn. Some children don't appreciate what they have. And Heron, because Heron trusted the woman sitting in Grace Townsend's chair, believed her. 16 years is long enough to build a life. It's also long enough to lose a father one phone call at a time. I'll spare you the montage. Seattle was hard, then manageable, then mine. I started as a receptionist at a real estate office, answering phones, filing paperwork, learning the business the same way my father had taught me, by paying attention. I got my license at 22. By 28, I'd opened a small brokerage, 3 agents, a shared office above a bakery, nothing glamorous. I wasn't rich, but I paid my own rent, chose my own curtains, and nobody moved me to the basement. I called my father every month. At first, the calls lasted 20 minutes, then 10, then 5. Vivian was always nearby. I could hear her breathing or humming or asking him who was on the phone in that sweet, innocent voice that meant, "Wrap it up." My father's voice got quieter each year, like a radio slowly losing signal. I sent letters, birthday cards, photographs of my office, my first closing, the view of the Olympic Mountains from my desk. He sent back short replies. "Proud of you, sweetheart," in handwriting that grew shakier with time. Through the Harland grapevine, I heard pieces. My father had sold 2 of his rental properties. Vivian had redecorated the house again. Derek, now in his 20s, had dropped out of community college and was living at home, doing nothing in particular. Paige had left for school somewhere on the East Coast. Then, 2 years before he died, I learned my father was sick. Heart failure complicated by something in his lungs. I called Vivian and asked to visit. "Richard needs rest, Sabrina. Visitors agitate him. The doctor said so." I called again a month later. "He's sleeping. I'll tell him you called." I called his cell phone directly. It went to voicemail every time. I didn't know it then, but my father was already making plans of his own. In the gaps between Vivian's surveillance, when she left for errands, when she met with her hairdresser, when she drove to the next town to see the lawyer, my father picked up the hospital phone and dialed a number he'd kept folded inside his wallet for 30 years. But I wouldn't learn about that phone call until after the funeral. I almost wasn't allowed to attend. My father died on a Wednesday morning in March. And I found out from the woman who had spent 16 years making sure I couldn't be there when it happened. Vivian's call was short and administrative, like she was canceling a dentist appointment. "Your father passed this morning. The funeral is Saturday. It's a small family gathering." She hung up before I could answer. I drove 3.5 hours from Seattle to Harlem in a state that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite fury. It was something older than both. The dull awareness Thatvin in death, Vivian had found a way to manage the situation. The church was small, white, steepled, filled with people who'd known my father their whole lives. I walked in 10 minutes before the service wearing the only black dress I owned and immediately understood the arrangement Vivian had made. The family pew front row left side held 3 people. Vivian in pearls and a black suit, Derek in a sports coat he kept tugging at, and Paige who stared at her hands. The rest of the church was seating for guests, which is where I was directed. I walked toward the casket anyway. My father lay in a navy suit with his hands folded, and for one breath he looked like he was napping on the porch after mowing the lawn. I reached out to touch his hand. Derek stepped in front of me. Mom said, "Family only at the casket, you understand, right?" 12 rows of Harland residents watched me stand there, arm half extended, reaching for a father I hadn't been allowed to reach in 16 years. Nobody said a word. Nobody stood up. I sat in the back pew. I said goodbye from 20 ft away, which is exactly the distance Vivian had been building between us since I was 16. After the service, as I stood in the parking lot breathing cold cedar air and trying not to scream, I noticed a woman I didn't recognize sitting on a bench near the back entrance of the church. Gray-haired late 50s hospital lanyard still clipped to her jacket. She looked at me and she nodded just once, just slightly. The way someone nods when they know something they haven't said yet. That evening, I received an email from Vivian's attorney. The will reading was scheduled for Monday. Attendance is limited to individuals named as beneficiaries in the deed's last will and testament. My name was not on the list. Vivian was wearing pearls the morning she tried to erase me from my father's legacy. Real pearls, the kind my mother never owned because she said they made her neck itch. I arrived at attorney Frank Garrett's office at 9 sharp on Monday. The building was downtown Harland, red brick, brass nameplate, the kind of respectable that small towns use as shorthand for trustworthy. I pushed open the glass door and walked into a reception area that smelled like leather chairs and old carpet. Vivan, Derek, and Paige were already seated around a conference table. Garrett, a thin, careful man in his 50s, stood near the window with a folder in his hands. Everyone looked up when I entered. Vivan's expression shifted from surprise to amusement in about half a second. She stood up and positioned herself between me and the empty chair. "This meeting is only for heirs named in the will, Sabrina." She smiled, not a mean smile. Worse, a patient one. The kind you give a child who's wandered into the wrong classroom. "You heard her," Derek said, leaning back in his chair. "This isn't your meeting," Garrett cleared his throat. "Mrs. Townsend." Under state law, biological children are typically entitled to notification regarding she's been notified. Vivian said smoothly, "I called her myself. She knows the situation." She turned back to me with that same measured smile. "We appreciate you coming all this way, sweetheart." But Richard's wishes were clear. The clock on the wall ticked. Garrett looked at the floor. Paige looked at her hands. I let 3 seconds pass. Then I set the manila folder on the conference table. Gently. "The way you set down something valuable. I'm not here to argue, Vivian. I just need to give your lawyer something." Vivan glanced at the folder. "What is that? A sympathy card? You could call it that." Garrett reached for the folder. His hand paused over the letterhead. Cream paper embossed name. I watched recognition cross his face. He knew the name on that paper. Everyone in Washington probate law knew that name. He opened the folder and the room went very, very quiet. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The clock kept ticking and Vivian's smile, that polished, practiced 16-year smile, started to crack at the edges like paint peeling off an old fence. The phone rang at 9:47 p.m. I almost didn't answer. I'd already had enough of Heron for one lifetime. Let me rewind. This was Saturday night, hours after the funeral. I was sitting in my rental car outside the Pinerist Motel on Route 9, still in my black dress, engine off, watching rain hit the windshield in sheets. I hadn't eaten since breakfast. I hadn't cried since the parking lot. I was doing that thing where you sit so still that you almost convince yourself you've stopped existing. The call came from a local number I didn't recognize. "Miss Townsend, my name is Helen Briggs. I was your father's hospice nurse for the last 8 months." Her voice was horsaro and careful, the voice of a woman who'd rehearsed this call before making it. I don't know if I should be calling, but I can't keep quiet anymore. The motel sign blinked red through my rain-streaked windshield. I pressed the phone harder against my ear. Helen told me things that made the last 2 years rearrange themselves like furniture being dragged across a floor. My father had talked about me every single day. Every day. He'd kept my photograph on his nightstand until Vivan moved it to a drawer. He'd asked visitors for my phone number until Vivan stopped allowing visitors. He'd tried to call me himself, but his cell phone had been misplaced. Vivan said she'd look for it and never did, but twice. Twice when Vivian left the hospital to meet with her attorney, my father asked Helen to dial a number written on a scrap of paper hidden in High's nightstand drawer. Not my number, a different one. He asked me to tell the woman who answered. "Richard is ready. Sabrina deserves the truth." Who was the woman? I asked, and my voice didn't sound like mine. Her name was Margaret Calloway, an attorney. I looked her up afterward. She specializes in estate law. Her office is in Bridgewater, about 40 minutes from here. Helen paused. Then she told me the last piece. She'd watched Vivian bring paperwork to my father's bedside on 3 separate occasions, always after his evening medication, always when his eyes were glassy and his speech slurred. Helen had recorded the dates in her nursing log. "Your father talked about you every single day, Miss Townsend. Every day. I just thought you should know that." I sat in that parking lot for another hour after Helen hung up, but I wasn't still anymore. Margaret Calloway's office smelled like old paper and strong coffee, the kind of place where important things were kept safe. Sunday morning, 8 a.m., I drove 40 minutes to Bridgewater, a town even smaller than Harland, and found Margaret's office above a hardware store. Oak door, brass handle, a potted fern in the window that looked like it had been there longer than I'd been alive. Margaret was 62, silver-haired with reading glasses on a chain and the posture of someone who'd spent decades sitting across from people in the worst moments of their lives. She didn't shake my hand. She hugged me. Then she sat me down and told me what my father had done. "Your father called me 14 months ago. Margaret said he used the hospital room phone while your stepmother was at an appointment. He was angry. Sabrina angrier than I'd heard him in 30 years. He said a woman he didn't trust had brought him papers to sign while he was medicated. He said she was taking everything. And he said he wanted to make it right. Margaret had been my father's attorney since before he married my mother. She drafted his original will, the one that left the house, and the majority of his estate tome. When Vivian entered the picture, my father had never updated that will with Margaret. Vivian had engaged her own lawyer, Garrett, to draft a new one. I drove to the hospital twice, Margaret continued. The second time I brought 2 independent witnesses and arranged for his physician to conduct a cognitive evaluation beforehand. Your father passed with flying colors. He knew exactly what he was doing. She slid a document across the desk. Cream paper, blue ink, my father's signature, shakabut legible. Witnessed, notarized, dated 14 months ago. The will left the house and 60% of his estate to me. The remainder went to the community scholarship fund he'd started before I was born. Vivan was allocated a reasonable monthly stipend, enough to live on, not enough to control. Derek and Paige were not mentioned. Your father was very clear, Miss Townsend. Margaret removed her glasses. He said, "I failed my daughter once. I will not fail her from the grave." I held that piece of paper with both hands. My father had been dying, controlled, monitored, medicated, and he had still found a way to fight. Not with his fists, with a phone call and a pen. The light through Margaret's oak-framed window was warm and sharp, and a mockingbird was singing in the tree outside like it was just a regular Sunday morning. For everyone else, maybe it was. Attorney Garrett read slowly. That was how I knew it was real. Lawyers don't read slowly unless they're reading something that changes the room. Let me bring you back to Monday morning, back to the conference table, back to the moment Garrett opened my manila folder and the clock on the wall became the loudest thing in the building. He turned the first page, then the second. His eyes moved down the cognitive evaluation, across the witness signatures, through the notarization seal. His jaw tightened the way a man's jaw tightens when he realizes he's standing in a building with a cracked foundation. "Mrs. Townsend," he said carefully. "This appears to be a second will executed after the one currently in my possession." Vivian hadn't moved. Her hand was on the armrest, her knuckles whitening around the polished wood. "It includes a cognitive evaluation conducted by Dr. Feldman, 2 independent witnesses," and he paused. "An affidavit from a registered nurse detailing concerns about the circumstances under which the prior will was executed." Silence. The kind of silence that has weight to it. You could feel it pressing on your eardrums. "What are you saying?" Vivan's voice came out thin, stripped of its usual melody. "I'm saying that if this document is authenticated and the letterhead suggests it was prepared by Margaret Calloway, whose reputation in probate law is well established, then the will I was asked to read today may be subject to legal challenge." Derek shoved his chair back from the table. "This is ridiculous. Dad would never sit down, Derek." I said it quietly, but the room was so still that it landed like a door slamming. "Let the lawyer read." Derrick's mouth opened, closed, opened again. He sat. Garrett looked at me, then at Viven, then at the documents in his hands. He was a careful man. I could see him calculating liability, obligation, exposure. "I'm going to recommend that we suspend today's reading," he said. "I'll need to verify these documents with Ms. Calloway directly. If they're legitimate, we'll need to reopen the probate process." Paige was watching her mother. Something shifted behind her eyes. Not anger, not sympathy, recognition. The look off Somyeon seeing a picture they'd been staring at for years suddenly come into focus. Vivian's fingers twisted the wedding ring on her left hand. Around and around metal scraping skin, as though if she turned it fast enough she could rewind the last 5 minutes. Vivian did what Vivian always did when the ground shifted beneath her. She became the victim. It took about 4 seconds. She straightened her back, pressed her hand to her chest, and when she spoke, her voice carried the exact pitch of a woman wronged by the universe. "I nursed that man for 2 years. Her eyes glistened on cue the way they always glistened when she needed the room to feel sorry for her. I sat beside his bed every night. I held his hand when he couldn't breathe. And where were you, Sabrina? Where were you for 16 years? It was a good performance." I'll give her that. Derrick jumped in like a man who'd been waiting his whole life for someone to hand him a script. She abandoned Dad. Everyone in Harlem knows that. And now she shows up with some fake papers trying to steal what's ours. Ours. There it was. The word that explained everything about Derrick Marshall in a single syllable. Viven turned to Garrett, her chin lifted, her voice dropping into the register she saved for authority figures. "Frank, I want to file a forgery complaint. That woman manufactured those documents to steal my husband's estate." Garrett's face did something complicated. He was her lawyer. He was also an officer of the court. Those two facts were pulling him in opposite directions, and you could see the strain in the lines around his mouth. "Mrs. Townsend, I'd advise against making any formal allegations until I know my husband's wishes, Frank. I know them. I didn't raise my voice. Attorney Calloway is available to verify every document. Her number is on the 2nd page." And then a voice came from the corner of the room. Small, uncertain, but clear enough to land. "Mom, maybe we should just let the lawyer check." It was Paige. She hadn't spoken since I'd walked in. Viven turned toward her daughter with an expression I'd seen before, the look she gave anyone who stepped out of line, surprise wrapped in steel. Paige, not now. Paige looked at her hands, but she didn't take it back. Vivian twisted her ring again. The fluorescent light buzzed above us. Garrett gathered the documents into a neat pile and said he would be in touch within the week. I picked up my bag and walked out. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could hear Vivian's composure crumbling behind me like plaster falling off a wall, quietly in pieces when no one was watching. I'd never visited a grave before. I didn't know you could feel someone's absence more standing above them than anywhere else in the world. After the suspended reading, I drove to the cemetery on the east side of Harland, where the headstones face the mountains. My father's grave was fresh, dark soil mounted under a temporary marker. No grass yet, no flowers except the arrangement left over from the funeral, already browning at the edges. I stood there for a long time. The ground was wet from last night's rain, and the smell of turned earth mixed with cedar from the treeing. Wind came down from the ridge, cold and steady, carrying the sound of nothing in particular. I thought about the last phone call. 3 months before he died, my father's voice had been so faint I'd pressed the phone against both ears. He'd said, "I'm sorry, sweetheart, I wasn't as strong as you." I hadn't understood. I'd thought he meant his health. Now, standing above him, I understood he'd meant everything else. The years of letting Viven decide, the silence, the slow surrender. He'd known. He'd always known. He just hadn't been able to stop it. "You were stronger than you think, Dad," I said to the dirt. "You made a phone call when you could barely hold a phone. You signed a document when you could barely hold a pen. That's not weakness. That's the last thing a man does when he's out of options." A sparrow landed on the temporary marker, pecked at nothing, flew away. The sun broke through the clouds for exactly the length of time it takes to draw one full breath and then disappeared again. I turned to leave and noticed something I hadn't seen when I arrived. On the far side of the grave, leaning against the base of the marker, was a small wreath, not from the funeral arrangement, which was formal and white. This one was simple. Wild flowers tied with twine. A card dangled from it, handwritten in careful, uncertain letters. "Forgive me, Dad." No signature, but I recognized the handwriting. The same round, hesitant script I'd seen on grocery lists stuck to the refrigerator for years. Paige, I left the wreath where it was. Then I walked back to my car and started planning what came next. Not revenge, something quieter than that. And I think something my father would have understood. I want to pause here for a moment because standing at my father's grave, I realized something I'd been running from for 16 years. That leaving wasn't the same as letting go. If you've ever had to walk away from someone you loved because staying would have broken you, I think you understand. Hit that subscribe button, because what happened when the lawyer verified that file? You're going to want to hear this. Margaret Calloway walked into Garrett's office 3 days later the way she probably walked into every courtroom, like she'd already read the last page of the book. Garrett had done his due diligence. He'd called Margaret's office. He'd contacted the witnesses. He'd reached Dr. Feldman, who confirmed the cognitive evaluation was on file. Everything checked out, which meant Garrett had a problem because the will he'd been hired to execute was now sitting across the table from a will that outranked it. The second meeting was smaller. Same conference room, same fluorescent lights, same ticking clock, but this time Margaret Calloway sat on my side of the table, silver hair, reading glasses, leather briefcase that looked like it had survived more courtrooms than some judges. And the energy in the room had shifted the way air shifts before a storm rolls in from the coast. Garrett laid it out carefully. The documents provided by Ms. Townsend have been verified. The second will was executed with proper witnesses, notarization, and a physician's cognitive evaluation confirming the testator's mental competence at the time of signing. He paused. Vivan sat rigid, her handbag clutched in her lap. Additionally, affidavit from registered nurse Helen Briggs raises concerns regarding the circumstances under which the earlier will, the one I hold, was signed. The dates cited in the affidavit correspond with medical records indicating significant pharmaceutical intervention. Margaret spoke for the first time. "Mr. Garrett, I'm sure you'll agree that a will signed under documented pharmaceutical impairment raises significant questions. I trust you'll advise your client accordingly." Garrett looked at Vivan the way a man looks at a client he can no longer help. "Mrs. Townsend, given the conflict of interest, I'm unable to continue representing you in this matter. I'd recommend you retain independent counsel." The room held its breath. Vivan had walked into this building 4 days ago with a smile and a string of pearls and absolute certainty that she owned my father's legacy. Now she was sitting in the same chair in the same pearls, and the chair was the only thing she still had a claim to. The afternoon light came through the blinds in thin slats, and Margaret's shadow fell across the conference table in a straight, unbroken line. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The documents spoke for themselves. That's the thing about paperwork. It doesn't care about your feelings. I'd imagined this moment 1,000 times. In none of those versions was I this calm. Vivan stood up so fast her chair rolled backward and hit the wall. The sound cracked through the room like a starter pistol. Richard loved me. Her voice had abandoned its usual melody. What was left was raw. The voice under the voice, the one she'd spent 16 years burying under charm and patience. He chose me. He chose this family. That girl left. She walked out and didn't look back, and I stayed. I stayed. Derrick was on his feet a second later, his palm flat on the table. "We'll sue. We'll take this to court. That nurse is lying. She's probably getting paid." Margaret didn't flinch. "You're welcome to litigate, Mr. Marshall, but I should mention that the affidavit includes specific dates, times, and medication logs provided by the attending physician's office. Mrs. Townsend may want to consult her own counsel before making public accusations against a licensed healthcare professional." Derrick opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The bravado had run dry, and underneath it was something I recognized from years of living under the same roof. A man who had never once been told no by anyone who mattered. Vivan turned to me. Her eyes were wet, but not with sadness. It was fury. The kind that lives in the chest, not the head. You ruined everything. I looked at her for a long moment. 16 years of distance, 2 decades of silence, and a lifetime of being told I didn't belong. I thought about the lavender she'd ripped out, the piano room sheet on the pillow that my father had found 20 minutes too late. No, Vivian, you started this 16 years ago. I'm just finishing it. A chair scraped against the floor. Paige stood up, gathered her coat, and walked out of the conference room without a word. Vivan called after her, Paige, Paige, come back here. But the door was already closing. The sound of that closing door was the only sound in the room for a full 5 seconds. Then Garrett cleared his throat and said the reading was concluded and both parties should prepare for formal probate proceedings. I picked up my folder. Margaret picked up her briefcase. We walked out together into a hallway that smelled like cleaning solution and old building, and neither of us said anything until we reached the parking lot. Then Margaret looked at me and said, "Your father was right about you. In a town the size of Harland, secrets don't stay buried. They just wait for someone to stop guarding them. I didn't tell anyone what happened in Garrett's office. I didn't need to. Derek did it for me." Within 48 hours, Derek was holding court at the tap room on Main Street, 3 beers deep, telling anyone who'd listened that I had forged my dead father's will and was trying to stealth family home. He said it loudly enough that the bartender heard it, the waitress heard it, and the retired postman at the end of the bar heard it and told his wife, who told her book club, who told the entire east side of Harland by Thursday morning. The problem with Derek's version was that it didn't hold together. People started asking questions. If the will was forged, why hadn't the lawyer rejected it? If Sabrina was a con artist, why had she been living quietly in Seattle for 16 years instead of scheming? And why was Margaret Calloway, a woman whose reputation in probate law was solid enough to build a courthouse on, involved? The questions led to memories, uncomfortable ones. The woman who ran the grocery store on Pine Street told her neighbor, "You know, I remember Richard asking me once if I had Sabrina's phone number." Vivian was right there pulling his arm, saying they had to go. I didn't think much of it at the time. The retired principal mentioned that Sabrina had been a good student, quiet, never in trouble, and that he'd always wondered why she'd left so suddenly. A member of the town council brought up something most people had forgotten. 3 years ago, he'd proposed naming the new community library wing after Richard Townsend, the man who funded half the town's scholarships. Vivian had shut it down. She said Richard didn't want the attention. The councilman recalled. But that wasn't like Richard at all. The story Vivian had built, the one where Sabrina was the ungrateful daughter who'd abandoned her poor, devoted father, started to develop cracks. And through those cracks, a different story was visible, one where a man had been slowly separated from his daughter, his community and his own voice, by a woman who mistook control for love. By the end of the week, people in Harland had stopped waving at Vivan from their cars. She didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she did, and that was worse. I almost didn't open the door. I was tired of Heron giving me reasons to stay up past midnight. It was Wednesday night, 4 days after the second meeting. I was still at the Pinerist Motel. Same room, same blinking red sign, same thin towels. I'd extended my stay because Margaret said the probate filing would take another week and there were documents to sign. The knock came at 9:15 p.m. soft. Hesitant, the kind of knock that's already apologizing before you open the door. Paige stood on the concrete walkway in Erin jacket 2 sizes too big, holding a wooden box the size of a shoebox. Her eyes were red, not fresh crying, the kind that's been happening for days in private where nobody could see. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside. She set the box on the motel desk next to the TV remote and a laminated breakfast menu. "I found this in his desk," she said. "The roll-top desk in the study. Mom never touched it. She said it was full of boring old paperwork." I opened the box. Inside, a photograph of me at 8 years old, sitting on my father's shoulders at the Harlem 4th of July parade, a dried sprig of lavender pressed flat and brittle. 3 birthday cards I'd mailed over the years still in their envelopes and a letter. The envelope was unsealed. The paper inside was cream-colored, the handwriting shaky but deliberate. My father had written one paragraph. "Sabrina, I drove to the bus station the morning you left. I was 20 minutes late. I stood in the parking lot and read your letter until a clerk asked if I was all right. I wasn't. I have never been all right since that morning. I'm sorry I was always late." The motel room was quiet. The ice machine hummed through the wall. Rain tapped against the window like it wanted to come inside. Paige was standing near the door, hands in her jacket pockets. "I didn't know," she said, "about any of it. I grew up hearing Mom say you left because you didn't care. I believed her. I'm sorry." I closed the box. I held it against my chest with both hands. "Thank you, Paige. This is the first time anyone from that family chose right." She nodded once, then she left the way she'd come, quietly without waiting to be thanked twice. The door clicked shut behind her, and I sat on the edge of the motel bed and read my father's letter again and again, and one more time until the words blurred and the room was blurry, and the only clear thing was the smell of pressed lavender, faint and stubborn, rising from a box that had been waiting 16 years to be opened. Probate is not dramatic. It's paperwork and patience and fluorescent lighting and waiting rooms that smell like old carpet. Margaret filed the petition to admit my father's second will to probate the following Monday. The filing landed in the county courthouse like a stone dropped into a pond. Quiet splash, long ripples. Vivan retained a new attorney, a man from Tacoma named Whitaker, who wore expensive ties and talked in paragraphs. He reviewed the case and, according to Margaret, advised Vivan that her options were limited. The evidence was clean. My father's will had a cognitive evaluation dated 14 months before his death. It had 2 independent witnesses, a retired school teacher and a notary public from Bridgewater, neither of whom had any connection to me or to my family. It had Margaret Calloway's seal, which in Washington probate circles carried roughly the same weight as a building permit stamped by God. On the other side, Vivan's will had been signed during a period when medical records showed my father was receiving significant doses of pain medication. Helen Briggs's affidavit documented 3 specific instances of Vivian presenting paperwork to Richard during these windows. Dates, times, names of medications administered. The attending physician confirmed that the dosages in question could impair judgment. Vivan's new attorney attempted one defense: spousal relationship and reasonable care. He argued that Vivian had been Richard's caretaker and deserved consideration. The court acknowledged this, then pointed out that the second will already provided Vivian a monthly stipend. Richard hadn't cut her off. He'd simply redirected the bulk of his estate to his biological daughter and his community fund. Derek filed a separate motion claiming inheritance rights as a stepson. It was dismissed within the week. He had never been legally adopted by my father. Under Washington law, that ended the conversation. The whole process took 11 weeks. No cameras, no courtroom speeches, just paperwork, hearings, and Margaret Calloway sitting across from a series of increasingly tired attorneys who knew they were holding a losing hand. When it was over, the judge signed the order admitting my father's second will to probate. The house on Miller Hill, 60% of the remaining estate, and control of the scholarship fund transferred to me. Vivian's stipend began the following month. Margaret called me that afternoon. "It's done," she said. 2 words, 11 weeks of work, and 16 years of silence. Finally answered. Derek did what Derek always did when things didn't go his way. He made them worse. I was back in Seattle when I got the call from the Harlan Police Department. A neighbor had phoned it in just before midnight. Someone was throwing furniture off the front porch of the house on Miller Hill. By the time the officers arrived, Derek had dragged a bookshelf into the yard, kicked in a window, and was working on the hallway closet, tossing boxes of my father's files into the wet grass. "If I can't have it," he reportedly told the officers. Then nobody should. They arrested him for criminal mischief and public intoxication. He spent the night in a holding cell that I imagined was about the same size as the basement room he'd taken from me when he was 12. I told the officer who called me that I wouldn't press charges, but he doesn't come near the house again. What I didn't learn until later, until the neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, told me during my next visit was what Derek had accidentally uncovered in his rampage. In the front hallway, behind a decorative drywall panel that Vivian had installed years ago to cover the old fireplace, Derek's wild swinging had punched through the plaster. And behind that plaster, wedged against the original brick, was a picture frame. Mrs. Callahan had pulled it out after the police took Derek away. It was my parents' wedding photograph. Richard and Grace standing on the porch of the house on Miller Hill, 1986. My mother in a simple white dress. My father in a suit that didn't quite fit. Both of them smiling like they'd just gotten away with something wonderful. Vivian had hidden it. Not thrown away. Hidden. Behind a wall she'd built herself as though she could brick over my mother's existence and call it renovation. Mrs. Callahan handed me the photo in a paper bag. "I thought you should have this," she said. "Your mother was a lovely woman." I held the frame. The glass was cracked from Derek's impact. A single diagonal line running between my parents' faces, but the photo itself was intact. I could see my mother's dress, my father's crooked tie, the porch railing behind them that my father had painted green that same summer. Some things survive being hidden, some things survive being broken, and some things survive both. I didn't expect to feel anything when I saw Vivian sitting alone in that kitchen. But grief does strange things. It reminds you that even the people who hurt you are still people. I drove to Harlan the following weekend to sign the property transfer documents. Margaret had mailed them to the counter recorder, but there were details that needed handling in person. Utility accounts, insurance, forwarding addresses, the kind of mundane business that follows every upheaval. Vivian was in the kitchen when I arrived, not packing, just sitting at the table with 2 mugs of tea in front of her, one on each side, as though she'd been expecting company. The refrigerator hummed in the silence. The afternoon light came through the window above the sink, dirty with months of neglect, and cast a yellowish square on the linoleum floor. She looked smaller, not physically. Vivian was still tall, still blonde, still put together in that careful way she always was, but something behind her face had collapsed. The way a building looks fine from the outside, even after the foundation has shifted. "Derek said his cousins," she said without looking up. "Paige won't return my calls." I set the documents on the table between the 2 tea mugs. Neither of us reached for them. Then Vivian said something I didn't expect. "I know I did wrong." She paused. Her fingers were wrapped around the mug, knuckles pale. "But you don't understand what it was like before Richard." My first marriage ended badly. I raised 2 kids alone. I had nothing. Richard gave me a life. I was terrified of losing it. She looked at me for the first time. Her eyes were dry. This wasn't a performance. This was the thing under the performance. A woman whose grip on security had been so desperate that she'd crushed everything soft in her reach. "I understand fear," Vivian said, "but fear didn't make you cut up my mother's garden. Fear didn't make you put me in the basement. Fear didn't make you hold papers in front of a dying man's face while he was too drugged to read them. You did those things. And being scared doesn't make them somebody else's fault." She didn't argue. She signed the documents. The pens scratched against the paper and the 2 mugs of tea sat on the table growing cold. And neither of us drank them. And neither of us pretended this was a reconciliation. It wasn't. But it was an ending, and sometimes that's enough. Helen Briggs was the kind of woman who carried other people's pain without complaint and went home to microwave leftovers alone. I met her one last time before I left Har at the hospital cafeteria because Helen was on shift and didn't take long breaks. She was wearing scrubs and the same lanyard I'd seen at the funeral, and she looked exactly like a woman who had been doing hard work for a long time without asking for recognition. I'd brought a thank you card. She waved it away before I could open it. "I didn't do it for you, Miss Townsend. I did it for your father. He was the best patient I ever had." She poured herself coffee from a machine that looked like it had survived the Cold War, added 2 sugars, and sat across from me at a table that smelled like disinfectant and cafeteria soup. "In the last few weeks," Helen said, "your father talked about the lavender." He'd close his eyes and described the garden, where each row went, how the bee sounded in July, how your mother used to cut bundles and hang them by the kitchen window to dry. He remembered the smell. He'd say, "Helen, my daughter got her mother's stubbornness. That's why she'll be fine." I held the coffee I wasn't drinking. The hospital corridor outside the cafeteria was quiet. Mid-afternoon lull, the hour when nothing urgent happens and the building seems to breathe. He made me promise. Helen continued. He said, "If something happens and Sabrina doesn't know Thetruth, make sure she finds Margaret." I told him I would. "You kept that promise. I keep all my promises, Miss Townsend. It's the only thing I've got that nobody can take away." She smiled, a tired, honest smile, the kind that comes from a life of holding other people's hands in the dark. "Your father fought for you, not the way movies show it. No speeches, no big gestures. He picked up a phone when he could barely hold it. And he called the one person he trusted. That's courage, the real kind." I reached across table and squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. "Thank you, Helen. You gave me something 16 years couldn't, proof that my father remembered me." She nodded, finished her coffee, and went back to work. The cafeteria door swung shut behind her, and the smell of ethanol and flower arrangements drifted in from the hallway. And I sat there for a few minutes longer in the quiet with the echo of lavender in my chest. You know, Helen never asked for anything in return. She just did the right thing because it was the right thing. And I think that's what my father was counting on, that somewhere in the world there are still people like that. If this story reminds you of someone who stood up for you when nobody else would, share it with them. Now, let me tell you how this ends. The lavender took 3 months to come back. My mother would have said that was about right. Good things don't rush. I didn't sell the house. I thought about it for about 10 minutes on the drive back to Seattle, when the practical side of my brain pointed out that maintaining a property 3 and 1 2 hours away was expensive and inconvenient. Then I thought about my mother cutting lavender in the morning light, and my father building a porch swing on a Saturday afternoon, and a letter that said I was 20 minutes late, and the practical side of my brain shut up. I hired a crew from Bridgewater to restore the property. The drywall Vivian had used to cover the fireplace came down first. Brick underneath, still solid, still the same brick my parents had roasted marshmallows against when I was 5. The linen curtains came down. The piano was tuned. A local nursery donated lavender starts, the same variety my mother had grown. And by midsummer, the backyard was lined with purple again, humming with bees. I used a portion of the estate to reestablish my father's scholarship fund, the Richard Townsend Community Scholarship. Same name, same purpose, same belief that kids from small towns deserve the same shot as kids from anywhere else. Margaret helped with the paperwork. Helen was the first person I told. The house became a community center. Not officially, not with permits and boards, just in the way that things happen in small towns when someone opens a door and keeps it open. Tuesday, piano lessons came back. A retired teacher started a children's reading hour on Saturday mornings. A few neighbors organized a community garden in the empty lot next door. And somehow, without anyone planning it, the house on Miller Hill became what it had been before Vivan turned it into a fortress, a place that belonged to everyone. I didn't move back to Harlem. My life was in Seattle. My office, my clients, my view of the mountains. But I drove out once a month now, and each time the road felt a little shorter. Not because the distance had changed, but because I wasn't running from anything anymore. The first time I heard a piano chord echo through the hallway, a student practicing scales, simple and imperfect and beautiful. I stood in the doorway and let the sound wash through me like warm water. Some houses remember. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Lavender envelope, handwritten address, no return name, but I knew who it was from. 2 months had passed since the probate order. I was at my desk in Seattle reviewing a listing agreement when the mail came. The envelope was pale purple, the color of the lavender my mother used to grow, though I couldn't say whether Paige chose it on purpose. It felt deliberate. It felt like the kind off thing someone does when they're reaching for a connection they don't quite have yet. Inside was a single page handwritten in the same careful script I recognized from the grocery lists and the card on the grave. Sabrina, I've moved to Portland. I got a job at a nonprofit that helps families with housing transitions. I don't know if you'll find that ironic. I kind of do. Derek won't talk to me. Mom is in her apartment collecting her monthly check. She's stable. I don't visit often. That's not cruelty. It's survival. You probably understand that better than anyone. I don't know if we'll ever be family. I don't think I have the right to ask for that, but I wanted you to know. I went to see your dad's grave last week. I put fresh wild flowers, the kind that grow along the highway outside Harland. I wrote "Forgive me" on the card again. I don't know if he can hear it. I'm sorry for all the years I said nothing. I was a kid and then I was a coward and now I'm trying to be neither. Paige. I read the letter twice. Then I picked up a pen and a note card, plain white, no lavender, because I didn't want to oversell what this was. And I wrote back, Paige. He hears you and so do I. Take care of yourself. The door is open, but nobody is rushing you through it. Sabrina, I mailed it that afternoon. I didn't call. I didn't send a long, emotional response. I didn't offer Thanksgiving dinner or a guest bedroom or any of the things that movies tell you people are supposed to offer at this point in the story, because this wasn't a movie. This was two women, 20 years of tangled history between them, both deciding separately that honesty was worth more than comfort. Maybe that's how families start over. Not with a hug, with a letter and a careful open door. My father never saw the sunset from my office window. But on clear evenings when the light hits the frame of his photograph just right, I like to think he does. It was a Tuesday in late June. I was sitting at my desk in Seattle finishing a stack of closing documents when the sun dropped below the cloud line and did that thing it sometimes does over the Olympic mountains. Turn the entire western sky orange and pink and gold. The kind of colors that look exaggerated in photographs, but are just Tuesday evening in the Pacific Northwest. On my desk in a frame I'd bought at a second-hand shop in Harlem was the wedding photo Mrs. Callahan had pulled from behind the wall. The glass was still cracked. The diagonal line running between my parents' faces, but I decided not to replace it. The crack was part of the story now. Some things are more honest when they show their damage. Next to it, a smaller frame, a photograph of the lavender garden taken on my last visit. Purple rose, green stems. A single bee caught mid-flight in the afternoon light. If you looked closely, you could see the edge of the porch swing in the background. My father wasn't perfect. I'd spent enough years being angry to know that he'd been weak when he should have been strong. He'd let Vivan close doors he should have kicked open. He'd arrived at the bus station 20 minutes too late, and he hadn't come after me. And for 16 years, I'd carried that silence like a stone in my chest. But in the last year of his life, when his body was failing and his options were shrinking, Richard Townsend had picked up a telephone and called the one person he trusted and said, "My daughter deserves the truth." He'd signed a document with hands that could barely hold a pen. He'd hidden a letter in a desk drawer, hoping someone would find it. He didn't fix everything. He couldn't, but he did what he could. And sometimes, I believe this now, standing in the amber light of a Tuesday sunset, sometimes doing what you can is the whole point. The sun went down behind the mountains. My father's photograph caught the last of the light, and for just a moment, the crack in the glass looked like a thread of gold holding the picture together instead of splitting it apart. I drove back to Harland on a Saturday in June, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. That was the difference. The house on Miller Hill looked different now, and not just because of the fresh paint or the restored shutters or the sign by the front walk that read the Richard Townsend Community Center. It looked different because it was full again. There were bikes on the porch. There was a chalkboard easel by the door advertising Saturday Story Hour. There were two girls on the swing, one pushing, one laughing, and the swing chains were making that familiar metal creak that I remembered from a childhood that felt both 1,000 years ago and 5 minutes old. I parked in the driveway and walked through the garden. The lavender was in full bloom, silver, green, and purple, and the bees were everywhere doing their work, ignoring the humans entirely. The smell hit me the way certain smells do. Not through the nose, but through the chest, directly into the part of you that stores everything you thought you'd forgotten. Inside, a girl of about 10 was sitting at the piano, picking out a simple melody with 2 fingers. She stopped when she saw me. "Are you Miss Townsend?" "I am," she grinned. "Your dad must have been really cool." I looked at the piano, my mother's piano, back in its room, back where it belonged. I looked at the bookshelves my father had built, now filled with donated children's books. I looked at the fireplace, exposed again, the brick warm and rough and real. "He was," I said, "and he would have loved that you're here." She went back to her melody. I walked out to the porch and stood where my parents had stood in their wedding photograph. Same railing, same view of the valley, same green shutters. Wind came up from the cedar ridge, carrying the smell of lavender and cut grass and something sweet I couldn't name, and the town of Harland spread out below me, small and imperfect and familiar. My mother had said, "That house is yours, not the walls or the roof, what your father built inside it." She wasn't talking about the house. She was talking about love, the kind that survives being hidden, the kind that survives being broken, the kind that comes back eventually, like lavender in June. My name is Sabrina Townsend. I'm 34 years old, and this is my house. That's my story. It took me 16 years to find my way back, but I think the best journeys are the ones where you finally stop running. If this resonated with you, if you've ever had to fight for what Somyeon you loved wanted you to have, tell me in the comments. And if you haven't already, check the description for more stories like this one. Thank you for being here. It means more than you know.